A young millionaire thought he was marrying Jane for business, but she revealed a secret that changed everything. The towering glass walls of Steele Enterprises overlooked the bustling streets of New York City, where people moved in a rush, chasing dreams as fast as the city's heartbeat. Inside the sleek boardroom, Peter Steele sat at the head of a long, polished table, his fingers drumming impatiently against the armrest of his leather chair. Before we dive deeper into today's story, if you enjoy what you're watching, please hit that subscribe button. Every new subscriber helps me keep sharing stories that inspire and touch your day. Peter, this merger is critical. The authoritative voice belonged to Richard Morgan, the patriarch of the Morgan family, whose company Steele Enterprises was desperately trying to merge with Peter's. Sharp blue eyes met Richard's cold stare, and he resisted the urge to sigh. He'd heard this speech a dozen times already. Your company is in a strong position, but our family values tradition. Investors want stability, and frankly, Peter, they want to see you settled. Peter leaned back, jaw clenched. Are you seriously telling me I need to get married to close this deal? Richard gave a tight-lipped smile. Let's call it an assurance of reliability. Stability is everything, Peter, and right now, you don't have it. Peter exhaled sharply and glanced at his lawyer, Michael, who nodded in agreement. He's right, Peter. A marriage, at least on paper, would assure them you're not just a reckless businessman. It's a smart move. Smart move. Peter loathed the idea. Marriage was just another business transaction to him, and love? That was an illusion meant for fairy tales. Later that evening, in his luxurious penthouse overlooking Central Park, Peter swirled a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at the skyline. His mind raced with potential candidates, socialites, models, women from influential families. But none of them fit the discreet, uncomplicated image he needed. Then Michael's voice from earlier echoed in his head. What about Jane Thompson? She's already in the company, familiar with your world, and won't attract too much attention. Jane Thompson? Peter barely knew anything about her, aside from the fact that she was a legal assistant, quiet, practical, and most importantly, not the kind of woman who would demand emotional attachment. Plain Jane, they called her in the office, always dressed in muted colors blending into the background. Peter took another sip of his whiskey and smirked. Perfect. The next day, Peter walked into the legal department, his presence commanding attention as usual. The air around him shifted, whispers following his steps, but his eyes were focused on one person, Jane. She sat at her desk, typing diligently, her brown hair pulled into a neat bun, glasses perched on her nose. If she was surprised to see him, she didn't show it. Mr. Steele, what can I do for you? She asked, looking up with calm, steady eyes. Peter studied her for a moment before speaking. Can we talk in private? A few murmurs broke out across the room, but Jane simply nodded, closing her laptop and following him to a conference room. She took a seat, folding her hands neatly on the table, while Peter remained standing, pacing slightly. I'll get straight to the point, he began. I need to get married for business reasons, and I want you to do it. Jane blinked once, then again. Excuse me? Peter continued, his tone detached and matter-of-fact. This is strictly business. No romance, no strings attached. You get financial security, and I get my merger. Simple. Jane raised an eyebrow, but didn't look shocked, just curious. And why me? Peter shrugged. You're discreet, intelligent, and let's be honest, you don't exactly crave the spotlight. That's what I need right now. There was a brief silence, and Peter expected hesitation, maybe even laughter. But to his surprise, Jane leaned back and gave him an appraising look. Fine, I'll do it. Peter frowned slightly. Just like that? No questions? No concerns? Jane smiled faintly. I'm a legal assistant, Mr. Steele. Contracts are kind of my thing. Peter felt a flicker of intrigue. She was calm, too calm, but Jane continued, adjusting her glasses. There's one condition. Peter narrowed his eyes. What condition? She leaned forward slightly, her voice composed. I'll marry you, but there's something you need to know. In due time. Peter raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? Jane's lips curved into a small, enigmatic smile. You'll find out eventually. Peter was caught off guard by her quiet confidence. Most women would have bombarded him with questions or hesitated, but Jane, she was an enigma. He shook off the uneasy feeling and extended his hand. "So, do we have a deal?" Jane took his hand without hesitation. "We have a deal." As Jane left the room, Peter watched her go, a nagging thought lingering in his mind. She was supposed to be simple and predictable, so why did it feel like he had just made a deal with someone far more complicated than he imagined? He shrugged it off, convinced that whatever secret she had, it couldn't possibly change anything. After all, this was just business. The elevator door slid open with a soft chime, revealing the sleek, modern expanse of Peter Steele's penthouse floor. The windows overlooked the glittering skyline of New York City, and the scent of expensive leather and polished wood lingered in the air. Jane stepped inside, her modest suitcase rolling quietly behind her. Peter leaned casually against the marble counter, watching her with his usual detached expression. "Welcome home," he said, his voice smooth but distant. Jane glanced around, taking in the pristine space. Everything was immaculate, calculated, and cold. She smiled faintly. "It's impressive." Peter smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment. Make yourself comfortable. Just remember, this is temporary." Jane met his gaze with quiet confidence. "Of course. Strictly business, right?" Peter studied her for a moment longer, expecting hesitation, nervousness, something. But Jane merely walked past him, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. Over the next few days, Jane settled into her new life with surprising ease. She moved through the penthouse as if she belonged there, quietly organizing the kitchen, adjusting the lighting to make it feel warmer, and even placing a vase of fresh flowers on the dining table. Peter noticed. At first, he dismissed it as trivial, but as the days went on, he found himself pausing longer in the living room, appreciating the subtle touches of color and life that Jane had brought. It irritated him how easily she was altering his meticulously designed world. One evening, he found her in the kitchen, stirring a pot of something that smelled surprisingly good. "What are you doing?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Jane glanced over her shoulder. "Making dinner. You do eat, don't you? Or is that outsourced too?" Peter smirked but didn't respond. Instead, he leaned against the counter, watching her with curiosity. She was different. Peter's friends weren't as welcoming. A week after Jane moved in, Peter introduced her to his social circle during an exclusive rooftop party. The women, clad in designer gowns and dripping in jewels, eyed Jane's simple navy dress with barely concealed disdain. The men, laughing over cocktails, exchanged glances of amusement. "So, Jane, what is it you do again?" asked Victoria, Peter's ex-girlfriend, her smile dripping with condescension. Jane sipped her champagne calmly. "I'm a legal assistant at Steele Enterprises. Contracts and negotiations mostly." Victoria's smirk widened. "Oh, how practical." Peter always had a thing for ambitious women, but I suppose practicality has its charms. Peter bristled, but before he could speak, Jane tilted her head thoughtfully. "Well, ambition is relative, isn't it? Some chase power, others chase meaning. I suppose I prefer the latter." A flicker of amusement crossed Peter's face as Victoria's smile faltered. Jane had handled the insult with effortless grace, and Peter couldn't help but admire her poise. After the party, as they rode the elevator back to the penthouse, Peter broke the silence. "You handled them well tonight," he admitted. Jane shrugged. "I've dealt with worse. People tend to underestimate those they think are plain. It's an advantage." Peter glanced at her, intrigued. "You're not as plain as I thought." Jane smiled knowingly. "I never said I was." Just as Peter was beginning to adjust to Jane's presence, Victoria reappeared in his life. She showed up at his office unannounced, her polished smile and perfectly coiffed hair reminding him of the life he once thought he wanted. "Peter, you can't be serious about this arrangement," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "She's not your type. She's not our type." Peter leaned back in his chair, irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "It's none of your concern, Victoria." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "Come on, Peter. You and I both know this isn't you. She's too simple." For the first time, Peter felt a flicker of doubt creep in. Was Victoria right? Was he making a mistake? That evening, as he returned home, he found Jane curled up on the couch with a book, completely unbothered by his distracted mood. She looked up and smiled. Long day? Peter hesitated. Victoria came by today. Jane simply nodded. I figured she would. Peter frowned. You're not concerned? Jane set her book down and looked at him with calm confidence. Should I be? Her lack of insecurity irritated him. Yet somehow, it reassured him too. Who was this woman? One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dining table, Peter found himself watching Jane instead of eating. She was focused on her food, unaware of the way his gaze lingered on her. He was beginning to see her in a different light. Her simplicity wasn't dull. It was refreshing. Her confidence wasn't loud. It was steady. And for the first time in a long time, Peter felt something unfamiliar, a sense of peace. Yet deep down, he reminded himself, this is just business. Nothing more? Or was it? The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria shimmered with golden chandeliers and the soft murmur of high society conversation. Peter adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, his sharp eyes scanning the room filled with influential businessmen, celebrities, and political figures. This charity gala was a crucial event for Steele Enterprises, an opportunity to solidify relationships and secure potential investors. Beside him, Jane stood poised in a sleek black evening gown, simple yet elegant. Peter had expected her to appear out of place, awkward even among the glittering elite. But as always, Jane had a way of defying expectations. Ready for your grand debut? Peter asked with a smirk, leaning slightly toward her. Jane offered a calm smile. I think I'll survive. Peter raised an eyebrow at her confidence. We'll see, he muttered under his breath. As the evening progressed, Peter found himself observing Jane more than he intended. She moved effortlessly through the crowd, exchanging polite greetings and making engaging conversation. He watched as she spoke with Senator Caldwell, laughing at one of his dry political jokes, then effortlessly shifted gears to discuss business strategies with media mogul Eleanor Grant. Peter's surprise grew when he overheard Jane seamlessly switch between English, French, and Italian, charming various guests with her fluency and cultural awareness. Your wife is quite impressive, remarked a passing investor, Mr. Duca, swirling his champagne. Peter nodded, feeling an unfamiliar mixture of pride and confusion. Yes, she certainly is. As Jane mingled effortlessly, Peter found himself standing near Victoria, his ex-girlfriend, who watched Jane with thinly veiled disdain. I have to admit, Peter, Victoria said, amused, taking a sip of her wine, I thought she'd crumble tonight, but she's holding her own. Peter's jaw tightened. She's full of surprises, he admitted. Victoria's eyes gleamed with mischief. Are you sure you know who you married? That question stuck with Peter longer than he cared to admit. Later that night, as they returned to the penthouse, Peter loosened his tie, his mind racing with questions. Jane, as composed as ever, removed her earrings and set them on the dresser. Peter leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying her. You were impressive tonight. Jane glanced at him through the mirror. Thank you. I do my best. Peter took a step closer. You speak 3 languages fluently. You handle people like you've been attending these events your whole life. Jane turned to face him, her expression unreadable. I pick things up quickly. It's part of the job. Peter shook his head. No, Jane. This isn't something you pick up working as a legal assistant. Who are you really? Jane's lips curled into that mysterious smile of hers. Everyone has secrets, Peter. Even you. Peter's frustration bubbled beneath the surface. He was a man who valued control, but Jane was slipping through his fingers in ways he hadn't anticipated. Why did you agree to this arrangement so easily? Peter pressed. Jane stepped closer, looking up at him with unwavering confidence. Because sometimes the best opportunities come in unexpected forms. And perhaps I saw potential in you. Peter stared at her, his mind torn between suspicion and fascination. Potential. The idea that Jane saw something in him beyond the businessman shook him in a way he didn't like to admit. In the following days, Peter couldn't shake the thoughts running through his head. Jane was not what she seemed. and he was beginning to realize she never had been. He found himself noticing the little things, the way she read financial reports with ease, her knowledge of international law, and how she always seemed one step ahead in conversations. During a dinner meeting, an important client brought up an upcoming deal in Singapore, and before Peter could respond, Jane smoothly interjected with insights that left everyone at the table impressed. Peter couldn't help but stare at her in awe. Who was she? Late one night, Peter sat in his office reviewing Jane's personnel file. It was frustratingly generic: college degree, a few standard references, nothing unusual. But Peter knew better. There was more to her. His thoughts were interrupted by Jane appearing in the doorway, arms crossed, looking for something. Peter shut the file and leaned back, smirking. Just trying to understand my wife a little better. Jane tilted her head, a knowing glint in her eyes. You might not be ready for all the answers just yet. Peter chuckled, shaking his head. You love keeping me guessing, don't you? She smiled. Maybe just a little. As Jane walked away, Peter found himself smirking. She was a mystery he wasn't sure he wanted to solve, or simply admire. For the first time in a long time, Peter felt something unexpected: intrigue, admiration, and perhaps something more. The weekend sun casts a golden hue over the sprawling Steele family estate, a majestic blend of old-world charm and modern luxury. The estate, tucked away in the countryside, was a stark contrast to the glass and steel skyline of New York City. Peter parked the car in front of the grand entrance, turning to Jane, who sat quietly beside him, taking in the breathtaking view. Impressive, isn't it? Peter remarked, watching for a reaction. Jane smiled faintly, her gaze drifting over the vast gardens and towering oak trees. It's beautiful, but also a little lonely, don't you think? Peter paused, caught off guard by her observation. No one had ever described the estate that way before. He shrugged. It serves its purpose. Jane simply nodded, as if she understood more than he was willing to admit. Inside the grand dining room, Peter's father, Edward Steele, sat at the head of the long table, his steely gaze fixed on Jane. He was a man of few words, his presence alone enough to command a room. Peter had prepared himself for the usual cold reception, but Jane, as always, seemed unfazed. So, Jane, tell me, what is it you do again? Edward asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Jane placed her napkin neatly on her lap and smiled. I work in legal contracts, negotiations, ensuring everything is in order. Edward nodded slowly. And do you think that's enough to handle the complexities of our world? Peter shifted uncomfortably, expecting Jane to falter under his father's scrutiny. But she didn't. Instead, she met Edward's gaze with quiet confidence. Mr. Steele, I believe success isn't just about handling complexities. Sometimes it's about simplifying them. For a moment, there was silence. Then, to Peter's surprise, Edward chuckled, a rare, almost foreign sound. You're smarter than you look, young lady. I like that. Peter glanced at Jane, impressed. She had done what no one else could, earned his father's approval with a single conversation. That evening, after a long day of obligatory estate tours and intense conversations, Peter found Jane standing on the balcony, gazing at the stars. He stepped beside her, hands tucked into his pockets. You handle my father well today, he said, leaning against the railing. Jane smiled. He's not as intimidating as you made him out to be. Underneath it all, I think he just wants to make sure you're with the right person. Peter exhaled, looking out at the moonlit fields. Yeah, well, he's never been easy on me. For the first time, Peter let his guard down, sharing pieces of his past he rarely discussed. He spoke about the pressures of living up to his family's expectations, the constant feeling of never being enough, and how he had to build his own empire just to step out of his father's shadow. Jane listened in silence, not interrupting, not offering pity, just listening. And for the first time in a long time, Peter felt understood. It sounds exhausting, Jane finally said, her voice soft. Peter chuckled bitterly. You have no idea. Jane turned to him, her eyes filled with a quiet empathy that disarmed him. You don't always have to prove yourself, Peter. Sometimes being enough isn't about what you achieve. It's about who you are. Peter swallowed, her words hitting deeper than he cared to admit. I'm not sure I even know who I am anymore. Jane's hand brushed against his, lingering just long enough to send a shiver down his spine. Then maybe it's time you figured it out. As the weekend progressed, Peter found himself growing more and more drawn to Jane, not just for her intelligence, but for the way she made him feel at peace. Yet deep down, a part of him resisted. Love had no place in business. This was a contract, an arrangement, and allowing feelings to creep in would only complicate things. But then there were moments, like when she laughed, when she listened, when she looked at him like he was more than just a billionaire in a suit, and those moments terrified him. On their last night at the estate, Peter and Jane found themselves alone in the library, surrounded by the scent of old books and burning wood from the fireplace. They sat across from each other, a glass of wine in hand, the flickering flames casting shadows on Jane's delicate features. "You're not what I expected, Jane," Peter admitted, his voice low. Jane looked at him, curiosity dancing in her eyes. "What did you expect?" Peter smirked. "Someone less capable, less complicated." Jane tilted her head. "And now?" He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes dropped to her lips, and for a brief, electric moment, he leaned in. Jane's breath hitched, her gaze locking with his. The air between them thickened, charged with something neither of them was ready to name. But just as their lips were about to meet, Peter's phone buzzed loudly, shattering the moment. Peter cursed under his breath, pulling away. His reality crashed back in. He answered the call, his voice clipped and businesslike, while Jane sat back, composed, though her eyes held a flicker of disappointment. When the call ended, Peter ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I should get back to this." Jane nodded, standing gracefully. "Of course. Business comes first." Peter watched as she left the room, a lingering sense of something lost weighing heavily on him. As he stared into the fire, he couldn't help but wonder, was it possible that business wasn't the most important thing anymore? The penthouse was eerily silent as Peter stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city skyline. The contract was set to expire in less than a week, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted it to end. He had convinced himself this arrangement was purely business. No feelings, no complications, but Jane had become something else entirely. And that scared him. She entered the room quietly, dressed in her usual understated elegance, holding a glass of wine in her hand. Peter turned to her, the weight of their impending separation hanging heavy between them. "So, we're almost done here," he said, forcing a casual tone. Jane's lips curled into a small, unreadable smile. "Almost." Peter studied her, waiting for her to say something. Anything, but she just stood there, calm and composed as always. He cleared his throat. "I'll have the legal team finalize everything. We'll dissolve the marriage quietly, as planned. No fas punto." Jane took a slow sip of her wine and then set the glass down. "Peter, before we do that, there's something you should know." Peter crossed his arms, suddenly on edge. "What is it?" Jane took a deep breath, meeting his gaze. "I haven't been completely honest with you." Peter felt his stomach tighten. "About what?" "About who I am." Jane's voice was steady, but there was a hint of vulnerability beneath the surface. "I'm not just a legal assistant. I come from a very wealthy family." Peter's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" She hesitated for a moment, then continued. "My family is the Whitmore lineage, one of the oldest and wealthiest in Europe. I walked away from it all because I wanted to live life on my own terms. I didn't want my wealth to define me." Peter stared at her, completely blindsided. "Wait, you're telling me you're some kind of heiress?" Jane nodded. "Yes, but I wanted to marry someone who saw me for who I really am, not for my name, not for my fortune. That's why I took this job, why I agreed to your arrangement. I needed to know if love was possible without wealth being in the way." Peter's mind reeled. All this time, he had assumed she was just an ordinary woman, a plain Jane, a convenient choice. And yet, here she was, revealing that she had played the same game he had. "So, this was just a game for you?" he asked, his voice sharp. Jane's eyes softened. "No, Peter. This was never a game. This was my way of finding something real." Peter exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. And what did you find? Jane's expression didn't falter. I found that you're more than the man people think you are. That behind all the money, the power, and the walls you've built around yourself, there's someone who cares. And I care, Peter. Peter looked away, feeling exposed in a way he hadn't felt in years. He thought he had the upper hand in this arrangement, but Jane had always been one step ahead. I don't know how to feel about this, Jane, he muttered. She nodded understandingly. I didn't expect you to. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Peter finally shook his head and grabbed his jacket. I need some time to think. Jane watched him go, her heart heavy, but her eyes resolute. She had given him the truth. Now it was up to him to decide what to do with it. Peter walked the streets of New York aimlessly, the noise of the city drowning out the turmoil in his head. He thought about every moment they had shared, the quiet conversations, the way she effortlessly fit into his life, the way she had made him feel like more than just a businessman. And now, knowing the truth, he couldn't help but wonder, had he fallen for the real Jane, or just an illusion she created? He stopped at a bench in Central Park, sitting down heavily. He had spent his entire life chasing wealth, power, and control. Jane had never needed any of it, and yet somehow, she had shaken his carefully crafted world. Back at the penthouse, Jane sat alone, staring out at the skyline. She had known the risk of telling him the truth, but she had hoped just once that someone would accept her for who she truly was. But deep down, she feared she had pushed Peter too far. Would he ever trust her again? Hours later, Peter returned, finding Jane still awake, sitting on the couch. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her quietly, before finally speaking. You should be angry with me. Jane looked up, her expression unreadable. Are you? Peter sighed, running a hand down his face. I don't know. Igusanius frustrated. With you, with myself, with this whole situation. Jane nodded. I understand. Peter stepped closer, his voice softer now. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Jane met his gaze. Would you have treated me the same if I did? Peter didn't have an answer to that. He exhaled, shaking his head. I don't know what's real anymore, Jane. She stood, stepping closer. What we have, it's real, Peter, whether you believe it or not. Peter studied her, torn between anger, admiration, and something deeper he wasn't ready to admit. I need more time. Jane smiled softly. Take all the time you need. And with that, Peter turned and walked away again, leaving Jane wondering if he would ever truly come back. Peter paced the length of his office, the city skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a view that once reassured him. Now it felt suffocating. His company was in trouble. A major deal that was supposed to solidify Steel Enterprises' future had just collapsed. Investors were pulling back, stocks were plummeting, and for the first time in years, Peter felt like the empire he had built was slipping through his fingers. His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from board members and panicked emails flooding his inbox. He pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaustion settling deep within him. There had to be a way out. The door creaked open, and Jane stepped inside, holding a file in her hand, dressed in her usual understated elegance. She looked at him with a calm he envied. Peter, I heard about the deal. He didn't look at her. News travels fast. Jane walked further in, placing the file on his desk. It's bad, but it's not the end. There are options. Peter scoffed, rubbing the back of his neck. Options? You mean borrowing more money, making more empty promises to investors? Jane tilted her head. Or leveraging my connections. Peter's jaw clenched. He finally looked at her, his eyes stormy. I can't take your money, Jane. Jane sighed, crossing her arms. I'm not offering my money, Peter. I'm offering my help. There's a difference. He let out a bitter chuckle. Help? What do you think people will say when they find out the great Peter Steele had to rely on his wife's fortune to keep his company afloat? Jane took a step closer, her voice firm yet gentle. Why do you care what they say? This isn't about pride, Peter. This is about survival, and you know I have the connections that can fix this. Peter ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I built this company from nothing, Jane. I fought tooth and nail to get here. If I take your help, it feels like I've failed. Jane's eyes softened, and she reached for his hand. You haven't failed, Peter. You're human, and humans need help sometimes. He stared at her, her touch grounding him in a way he didn't expect. Why are you doing this? Jane smiled, her eyes filled with something he wasn't sure he deserved. Because I love you, Peter, and I don't want to see you lose something you worked so hard for. Peter swallowed the lump in his throat. I don't deserve you, Jane. Jane cupped his face gently, her gaze unwavering. Maybe not, but love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing, and I choose you. Something inside Peter shifted at that moment. The walls he had built around himself, the belief that he had to do everything alone, all started to crumble. Okay, he whispered, his forehead resting against hers. Okay. With Jane's help, Peter met with influential investors and secured new funding. Her strategic insight and connections with European markets opened doors Peter hadn't even considered. Together, they crafted a plan to salvage steel enterprises, and within weeks, the company was stabilizing. Peter watched Jane in awe during these meetings. Her poise, her intelligence, the way she commanded respect without demanding it. One night, after a particularly intense negotiation, Peter pulled Jane aside. You were incredible in there, he admitted. Jane smiled. I learned from the best. Peter shook his head. No, Jane, I've been blind this whole time. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Jane's smile faltered slightly, her eyes searching his. Are you sure about that, Peter? Because this whole thing started as a business arrangement, remember? Peter took her hands in his. Yeah, it did, but somewhere along the way, it became more. You became more. Jane blinked, her breath hitching. And what does that mean for us? Peter exhaled slowly. It means I want to do this for real. No contracts, no mergers, just us. If you'll have me. Jane's lips curled into a smile, tears glistening in her eyes. I'd like that. A month later, in a small, intimate ceremony on the rooftop of their penthouse, Peter and Jane stood facing each other, exchanging vows, not for business, not for convenience, but for love. The city stretched out behind them, but at that moment, neither of them cared about the world outside. I never thought I'd say this, Peter murmured, slipping a ring onto Jane's finger, but I believe in us, and I can't wait to see where this takes us. Jane smiled through happy tears. Neither can I. As they sealed their vows with a kiss, Peter knew this time it was real. The love he never believed in, the connection he never thought he needed, had found him in the most unexpected of ways. And for the first time in his life, Peter Steele finally understood that true success wasn't measured by wealth, but by the people who stood beside you when everything else crumbled. Thank you for joining us on Peter's unforgettable journey, a tale of ambition, hidden secrets, and the transformative power of love. From a marriage of convenience to a bond built on truth and vulnerability, Peter and Jane's story reminds us that true success isn't measured by wealth or business deals, but by the courage to open our hearts and embrace the unexpected. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring journeys. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and like the video to help us grow our community.